That was a new screen. Okay.
It goes on my end.
Did you see that?
No.
Okay, I don't know what the hell that was. All right, so we're back for the second part of episode 16, and we are going to get into the Pittsburgh Steelers rebuild versus reload. The series we kind of started a couple weeks ago, renamed, and now we have a new structure for this, so I'll get into that in a second. But first, I want to introduce the very special guest we have on for this week, Nick Martin. He is one of my favorite follows on Twitter. He's big into the film stuff, and I try to keep up with Austin. I'm going to be very outclassed here. I know it, but I'm going to do my damn best, but he's a great follow. Definitely check him out. But Nick, introduce yourself. Tell everyone where they can find you. Happy to have you.
Yeah, appreciate you guys having me on. Appreciate, the shout out and everything. You can follow me over on X or Twitter, as you like to call it originally, at the McNarton. I used to write a good bit for All Steelers over at SIS. Haven't been doing as much lately because I was doing work for Sports Information Solutions, charting data for them, which was a very interesting time. I'm currently podcasting over at Steelers DB, Derek Bell from Steelers Now, who's got a great YouTube channel. Highly recommend checking it out. Does great content over there. We've been doing podcasting over there for a good while, and we're having a good draft sessions. So if you ever feel like you want to get more of that, go definitely check that out.
Yeah, I will link all of those. I'll link the socials. I'll link the YouTube. All of it for Nick down in the description. And I just realized your Twitter handle is Mick Narton, and I thought I thought I got your name wrong. I'm like, how did I mess up?
Yeah, I was like, oh.
I was like, oh fuck. All right. So quickly to go over the structure of how we're doing this restructured series, we're going to go through every single positional group, and we're going to preface by saying if we think it should be rebuilt or reloaded. Rebuild or rebuilt would insinuate that you think multiple pieces need to be ripped out and multiple pieces need to be put back in, new pieces. Whereas a reload, you're probably keeping a lot of the same guys. You probably need one or two replacements, but it's nowhere near as much work. Whereas a rebuild is a full, a full rebuild, if you will. So we will start with the quarterback position. And it's funny because we kind of had a little bit of a conversation prior to the show. There's really no one under contract right now, no one notable for the Steelers. So it's like, is this a rebuild, a reload? But Nick, I'll let you give your own interpretation of it and let you spew your thoughts on this quarterback room.
So they're only going to have Skylar Thompson on a futures deal for the practice squad under contract. Everyone else is a free agent, including Kyle Allen, their third string backup. So a lot of expiring deals. Personally, I view this as a rebuild because I view that no matter who you bring in, that nothing is going to be a long-term solution. There's going to be a lot of ideas that are going to get thrown around. A lot of people are speculating they bring back Russell Wilson. Justin Fields is probably the personal preference for a lot of Steeler fans and analysts like myself. And I view him more as a short-term solution as opposed to a long-term solution. While there is long-term promise with what he provides in terms of his overall athleticism, his arm talent, all those types of things, a lot of it is put into mostly a theory. It's not quite come together for him fully as a thrower in terms of throwing with touch more consistently. He had a good stretch during the beginning of the season where he was starting, and it really was coming together a little bit, but then he had issues with
fumbling.
The snaps issue was so strange with how the team was just they couldn't figure it out with the snaps, and you couldn't tell if it was Fields or if it was the center. It was a lot of it was a mess at times, and I really think we saw down the stretch one of the instances of just Russell Wilson just kind of losing the steps in terms of athleticism, in terms of his ability to make guys miss. There was issues with him trying to force the ball into some areas that were less than ideal, and he had issues with fumbling, which was, you saw in the second Ravens game where he tried to run through a guy and he ends up just losing the ball. And he's just not that type of guy that can do that anymore. So my personal preference, this needs to be rebuilt entirely. I think you bring back Justin Fields if you can. There's a lot of interest around the league from what I'm reading all across, and it sounds like he's going to have a bigger market than we might expect. Maybe someone like Derek Carr ends up getting cut from like the Saints and he becomes one of those options. I personally think that the Steelers just can't run it back with Russell Wilson. I think we saw the limitations of what he is and isn't for this team. And I just don't think that it's going to bring like any sort of different solution to the table. So whether or not they decide to go with Fields, like as a short-term solution that fits them in terms of, building around the ground game, because we've seen what he can do with his legs, especially the quarterback power, those designed runs. They had a lot of success with that. And that's why you want to see them bring a guy like him back, because I think it brings them the most promise in the short term to kind of build around, similar to how the Eagles have built their team. While Hurts is not the most talented thrower, he's very good at being able to get to his guys, get the ball to his guys, and he's able to create on the ground, and it helps open things up for their ground game, for their running backs as well. And we saw how that worked, and building that offensive lineup is like one of the key things that we'll get into more a little later. But as far as I'm concerned, Fields my preference. I'd say Aaron Rodgers is probably second, just because I don't think he was as bad as people think he was this past season, but he's like an absolute like nightmare PR case off the field. So it's really hard to get a read from that situation. But in terms of like a short-term solution, bringing a guy in, you probably can attract Devontae Adams as well, which they need help at wide receiver. That would make a lot of sense for a short-term solution. And then you kind of look to the draft. The NFL draft is going to be very unknown with some of these quarterbacks. There's a lot of guys getting propped up like Jackson Dart, Tyler Shuck. One guy who's kind of falling a little under the radar right now because he's had a bit of a down season was Jalen Milroe out of Alabama. There are some raw aspects, like his accuracy sometimes goes from time to time. He had issues with fumbling. That is one of the key differences. That's one of the key things that's, in my opinion, one of his big issues is not necessarily pocket presence. It's holding on to the football as guys barrel down on him. And I think that's something that Milroe needs to improve upon. Was really interesting. At the Senior Bowl, he measured in with under 9-inch hands. And then he goes to the combine. His hands grew almost an entire inch. And I was like, what in the world is going on? But, you see some of these guys, they try to stretch their fingers out and, it helps their hand measurements, for these events. But it was interesting seeing Milroe, take it to almost a different level. And my buddy over at Steelers Now, Derek Bell, who does great work over there, I do some podcasting with him, like I mentioned. He was reporting that Jalen Milroe was working with Jordan Palmer, who's great with biomechanics and, synchronizing those lower half, the lower half mechanics to how you throw. And I think a lot of that shows that Milroe's dedicated to his craft. He understands that he's not a finished product. And I think that's the type of player that you want to bring in as a developmental quarterback if you're the Steelers, in which you can get probably on day 2. And, some teams might view him as a running back just because of how great of an athlete he is. I've been seeing a lot of teams reportedly seeing him as a running back. So yeah, if you don't solve the quarterback situation, hey, you have a heck of a dual threat guy that you could put in at running back, maybe even tight end, get creative with. But Milroe's probably the guy I would look at as far as I'm concerned. He's not getting as much hype as a lot of other guys. He's kind of falling under the radar. So if I was looking at a draft option, I'd view him as the option that I would go after. So in terms of rebuild versus reload, it's a rebuild. They don't have the future on the roster. They might have a short-term solution, but they might not even be able to keep their short-term solution given with all the expiring contracts that are on the quarterback room.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think you touched on basically everything I had written down. So I mean, my addition to this portion will be limited, but to your whole point of Justin Fields and your analysis of Justin Fields is pretty spot on. I wrote down that watching Justin Fields try to make a decision is like the process of asking my girlfriend what she wants to eat for dinner every night, just every snap. It's just an excruciating process, a decision that is just the end of the world every time. But it's not that serious. Just throw the ball. And I feel like Justin Fields has had that problem. So, but to that whole point of testing the open market and the quarterbacks that are available outside of him, there's just not much. So he's going to gain more interest than you probably would expect him to. So hopefully they get him under contract before that time comes, because it's going to get more difficult, within the next 5 days.
I agree, especially considering like it seems like teams really want Fields to hit that open market, and Fields is kind of like starting to explore that option more and more. I'm seeing like the Jets is like that team that's kind of trying to pry him towards free agency. So I definitely would keep an eye out on that for sure.
All right. So yeah, rebuild. I think we're all in agreement on that for quarterback. Well, actually, I did have one question I wanted to ask you both. Austin, if push came to shove, and I saw Dane Brugler do a mock draft today or yesterday, I don't remember, but he mocked Shedeur dropping to 21 and had the Steelers going with him. God bless. If that somehow happens, I will run outside naked, but I would be shocked, but nonetheless, if he's there, are you taking Shedeur at 21 for the Steelers?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think that's even possible. I think with how needy some of these teams like the Giants and the Browns and the Titans and the Raiders and the Jets, like how many like QB needy teams there are, I strongly doubt they'd let probably the second best one slide that far. I'm not that high on Sanders, but 20, were they 22 or 21? 21. Yeah, that's fantastic value. That's fantastic value to get a starting quarterback, especially if Fields is going to field a broader asking price than we probably initially thought. I would like Shedeur if that was somehow humanly possible. I wouldn't trade up for him, but if he fell there, sure. Why not? I can't hear anything right now. Just cut out.
Thanks. No, that was my fault. I was drinking my water. Yeah, I don't think he falls that far. Like, there's no way he does. And if he does, like, you have to be really low on Shedeur if you're not taking him as a QB needy team,
right
at that spot. So, all right, we'll move on to the running back room. Austin, we'll start with you again for this group of guys. Are you reloading or are you rebuilding? Because there's some interesting routes you could take here.
I like a reload. I'm a big Jaylen Warren fan. I don't necessarily view him ever as a like super high end RB1. I don't view him as a guy that gets a ton of touches per game, but I love the touches that he does get. So I really do like him to stay as this like high end RB2 in a committee. I do like the idea of going after another RB1 because it feels like Najee's just not coming back. So I've really targeted the second round to third round of the draft as the place where I like them to get their next running back of the future, especially if they get a guy like Fields back. Like, their identity is a rushing team at that point. So you do need to invest a little bit of capital into a starting running back. Then you have Jaylen Warren, and then pick your poison for RB3. I do really like a guy like a Hampton, a guy like a Quinshon Judkins as your starting running back, Jaylen Warren RB2, some kind of receiving specialist, special teams guy RB3.
Yeah, I was thinking along the same lines. Yeah, it sounds like Jaylen is going to be back. He's only an RFA, so it shouldn't take much to bring him back. But the Najee Harris discourse is polarizing. And Nick, I want you to bring some insight as to how you feel about Najee and how you feel the fan base feels about Najee. And I want to throw one more thing in too. I didn't know this, but Najee has never had a 40-yard plus run in his career. Over 1,000 touches, he's never gone for 40 plus yards.
Oh.
Yep.
Yeah.
That is true. He's not really an explosive runner. He's a guy who can consistently churn out like 15-yard runs because of how good he is at running through contact. I have had such wild opinions about Najee Harris over the years, and I've just come to the conclusion over the years. I just think he's a good player. I think he really is a good player. He can catch the ball out of the backfield. He can block very effectively in pass protection. He's a guy who can handle a lot of touches and still be able to give you production. Like, as we've seen, he's been able to consistently churn out 1,000-yard seasons. Even volume is still a skill. Being able to handle that much volume is a skill in its own right. And I think Najee Harris deserves a ton of credit for that. I do think he is scheme limited, though, in terms of what he can and can't do. It's unfortunate that the Steelers have kind of transitioned more to an outside zone system under Arthur Smith, but that is the direction they have gone. And as a result, I just don't think that Najee Harris is that scheme fit or is going to be the guy for the future for them, going forward. It doesn't mean that Najee's a bad player. It just means that it's not a proper fit anymore. He's a guy who really excels, on those gap scheme runs, going behind his blockers, getting lost in the A gap and just churning out those 4 to 5 yard runs consistently. He's not really that guy you want getting like out on the D gap and trying to beat a guy with speed. Like, they tried that too often. They tried those stretch toss runs with him this season, and it was mind-boggling how bad some of these plays were for Najee in terms of just being able to beat a guy with speed. Like, yeah, he can make guys miss. He can go through contact, but there's only so much you can do when your entire like scheme is based off a guy who can beat that outside angle. And Najee's not that type of player, but he is a good player, and I hope he gets the respect he deserves in free agency.
I do think a team could very easily use his services. Just like you said, like, volume is a skill. Like, that's a good way to put it. Not a lot of guys can handle getting put through a car crash every play the way he can. And yeah, I absolutely think there will be a team out there. The Raiders, I felt like there was some speculation, could be interested in Najee. Who else comes to mind? Who knows? Maybe like the Chargers on some off chance they need a running back. They like to have those guys that can bruise. We know that their offensive coordinator is big on keeping the ball on the ground, but to that
Loves
point,
to run gap, runs to love gap scheme power runs.
Yeah, absolutely. And to the whole point of Arthur Smith's new implementation, I felt like I keyed in on a guy in the draft that I became a fan of throughout the process of researching for this episode, and it's Jaden Blue, the Texas product. And of course, getting to the edge, hitting the D gap and getting the sideline is definitely his specialty. But the thing about him that I learned that is so cool is he understands the nuance of route running. He knows how to actually route run. And that's so very tough to find in a running back. This guy knows how to burst the top of a route. He knows how to be deceptive. He can catch outside of his frame. Like, those are things that this offense needs. They just need playmakers. Everyone talks about a receiver, maybe someone at tight end. They need just playmakers. And a guy like Jaden Blue that can offer that type of explosiveness, that type of versatility to be a matchup nightmare, I think could be awesome for this offense. And Danny Smith, big special teams guy, I'm sure he could find a way to use him in who knows what form or fashion. So Jaden Blue, what's he projected to be?
He's a day 3
pick.
Guy.
Yeah,
he's a day 3 pick.
I'd say day 3. Yeah,
I'm absolutely in on him.
Well done, good pull. I did some homework there. I appreciate that.
You're inspiring me.
He's a good player that just didn't, like you said, get a lot of volume at Texas because they had so many good running backs. But the tape that he did put up, and he had a good combine, was pretty good. So he's definitely worth taking a look.
He's more of one of those like scat backs, I would say. I don't necessarily like the fit with the Steelers, just because I think they're looking more for a guy who can tote the rock like almost as much as Najee was able to do, which is why I'm kind of looking at Caleb Johnson out of Iowa as that guy that they should go after, because they run outside zone pretty much exclusively, and he is so great at being able to find those backside cutback lanes and be able to and be able to churn out those explosive runs despite the 4.58 40-yard dash. He is a lot faster on tape than he looks. And while he's inexperienced in pass protection, that's why you bring Jaylen Warren back, because he's such a great pass protector. So
Yeah.
I kind of view it a little bit of a different way, but I like the Jaden Blue shout out. I think he's a very explosive player.
Yeah, I guess my difference in thought is I do feel like Jalen Warren can play a brand of football that not quite to Najee's level, of course, but I do think he is more physical than people will give him credit for. I think
Oh, I
people
agree with
view Warren as, a third down, change of pace, speedy kind of. It's not really his game. I think this guy can actually handle a lot more than he's been given in the past. And I know on granted a smaller sample size, but the last 3 seasons he's averaged more yards after contact than Najee has. So I think he can actually play that game a lot more than he's been given an opportunity to. So I think that's just my difference in thought process with that one.
I can totally respect that.
So we'll move to tight ends now.
All right.
I
Not much.
I ripped this one to fucking pieces. Like I went to town on the tight end room. Like I got passionate about the Steelers tight ends for some weird reason. So before I get into my rant, I'll let Nick you start it off before I go on a long tangent.
So I wouldn't really even classify this as a rebuild or a reload. I would just classify it as you just maybe need to add like one depth piece in the draft. I mean, Pat Freiermuth is under contract. He's still like really good pass catching tight end. He's actually grown more as a blocker the past couple of seasons, and I've been pretty pleasantly surprised with that area in terms of growth. And then we have Darnell Washington, who's exclusively a blocker, but he's damn good at it and basically looks like an offensive tackle as far as I'm concerned. The way he's able to, open up the scheme in terms of like fit for how like Arthur Smith will draw pass protection, he asks a ton out of Darnell Washington. And I think that's where Washington excels. He's great at that area. And while he can stretch the seams, while he has good athleticism, I don't necessarily think he is a guy that like you want exclusively running like stop routes and things of those natures, but utilizing him more underneath, I think is a priority because he was a guy who's really good at just being able to shrug guys off after the catch.
Mm-hmm.
Like he's just a mountain of a dude, but he's explosive. He can run through you. And I just really think that was such an underutilized like aspect to the Steelers in terms of their tight end room. But in terms of adding a guy, I would kind of look at like a Benjamin Urasic, who's been kind of like underlooked out of Georgia. He used to play at Stanford. He was actually a receiving weapon over at Stanford. He was known as a receiving tight end. He didn't really have blocking in his element. And he goes to Georgia because he wants to improve on his all-around game. And he actually really grows in that area of his game. And like I think Urasic is kind of going way under the radar right now as a potential day 3 tight end. So I would kind of like to see Pittsburgh look at him if they're able to, address their more important aspects, like go after the tight end position, because I do think this is an underrated tight end class in a lot of respects, even though a lot of them did not test very well down at Indy for the combine. But Urasic is a guy that I would very much like to see, fill out this tight end room.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Austin.
Yeah. I have it in the same boat. Yeah. I'm keeping the one and the two. Like, I think that they're a good 1-2 punch. Like you said, Freiermuth, he's a little bit more nuanced in terms of route running, like in terms of finding the soft spots, in terms of getting his head turned around and being like a quarterback's best friend. I love Freiermuth for that. And like, he might not be your guy that would ever flirt with 1,100 yards. He's not that kind of guy, but he's just a good, safe tight end, which is what a tight end should be. Darnell Washington's a little trickier because like, he's humongous and he's powerful and he's athletic, but he's stiff. So it's like, it's a very weird combination of like really good ball skills, but he can't run routes. It's a really weird thing, but like he is a monster in a player that most teams would be lucky to call their tight end to. And then they're going to have a hold the tight end 3, like the tight end 3 spot. Like you said, not too much of an investment, just a kind of guy that can offer something that they can't. I like even like a free agent, like a Tommy Tremble, where like, you view it like just a good athlete that you can kind of use as like a joker tight end. Nothing serious. Again, not even really a reload. It's just like add another one. Add some depth. Maybe even add a practice squad. Like it's nothing serious. But like that's why I'm shocked you have much of a rant going on, because like I feel like this was like honestly my easiest one to view. Like it's 2 good tight ends and then find the third.
I guess my issue with it is this team was just so sluggish. And when you have Darnell Washington running like 230 plus routes, you have to like be able to understand why you're probably sluggish. You have Najee Harris toting the rock. You have Darnell Washington and 12 personnel out there running too many routes. Like George Pickens, Calvin Austin, I guess, is your fastest player, but he's not always out there. And he's, a whole nother argument. But it just, to me, I think like the whole idea, like a Tommy Tremble, even something like that, someone you can actually put out there a little bit more than Michael Pruitt. Like, I feel like Darnell was just out there too much. And I think it limited what the offense could do in terms of like threatening the defense. And like a Kylan Granson, even like, I don't know, just something else in the room. Or if we're going to draft a guy, Mitchell Evans, too, like if you want to have a guy that can block and that's your priority. I don't know. Maybe they did utilize him wrong, and that's where my confusion came in with Washington.
It's a fair criticism because the offense wasn't perfect. Like, obviously, they do have they do have something to improve on, and that's something you can find. Is I think it was most effective when Russell Wilson was in because the team wasn't as scary as a rushing threat. But I do think if they have Fields in there where like their identity is like a heavy rushing offense, I do like Washington out there because it's a good mix, and like they're not going to have to really spread the field as much when they have Fields at quarterback. But if they do decide to go to like God forbid, like a Darnold or a Rodgers or somebody else that's pass heavy, I do kind of agree with you.
Yeah, that's true. I didn't think about it that way either, even though I do have Fields as the returner. So that's a fair point.
I do too.
Yeah, I don't know. It probably is, like, to Nick's point, if they used him differently, I could feel different, but I just too many routes. Stop.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we'll move on to the wide receivers. There are so many different avenues with this room. Like, what, Austin, what do we do?
It's hard to say reload or rebuild because I do think that they need a few pieces, but I do like some of the ones they have. So I don't really necessarily want to like push anybody down the depth chart, but there is a few guys I'd like to bring in. So George Pickens makes a fun nucleus of a receiver room. We know what he is at this point, and he's pretty darn good at what he does. But there are limitations to him being your wide receiver one or your highest volume guy. There is a Rowan Wilson that everyone seems to forget is coming back from injury, who was a day 2 pick. People are kind of torn on him. He didn't have a lot of volume in college, so we don't really exactly know what his ceiling is at receiver. But he does have a lot of talent and kind of can fit that, across the middle slot role they've been trying to look for a while. I like Calvin Austin. I don't necessarily like Calvin Austin as a starter, but I do love him as like a rotational, take the top off the defense, be your speed guy, be that 4.2 something speed guy. But I do think that they're missing one guy at least. I feel like there's a piece missing, a high-end wide receiver 2 that's missing. And I feel like you can attack that in the draft, or you can look at a guy like a Christian Kirk, like we were talking about earlier, a guy that can kind of fill in as a higher volume guy for a fairly affordable price, but still can save you money and save your first-round draft pick.
Yeah, I agree. Nick, what were your thoughts on, because Christian Kirk, of course, got released today, and I saw Nick Farabaugh, one of his first tweets was, this is a Steeler, this has Steelers all over it. What were your thoughts on that?
So Farabaugh does great work over at Penn Live. There was quite a lot of interesting, receiver stuff that was coming out today that I was kind of missing as I was like recovering a little bit today. And I was looking at I was looking at stuff, and Christian Kirk, he's more of one of those guys who plays as a slot receiver, and I feel like the Steelers just have too many guys of that archetype. Then there was the news about DK Metcalf requesting a trade. They've apparently poked around there, according to Zachary Smith over at Steelers Now, that they've called them before. They called them last year. So we'll see what happens. But as much as I really like Omar Khan, his work with the wide receiver room last year was an absolute catastrophe. I was very unhappy with the amount of snaps that Van Jefferson was getting at wide receiver. It just it baffled me. It blew my mind, and the fact that he had to be like one of their best blockers consistently is an absolute travesty. Roman Wilson was probably going to be one of those blockers for them, and while he lacks size, he is very feisty. He shows a lot of physicality in that aspect. But in terms of his routes, this is an evaluation perspective. So this is what I saw from him coming out of college. I thought he struggled dealing with contact both at the release and at the top of route stems. Consistently saw guys just get into his chest. It seemed like he couldn't free himself up. And I'm just not sure that Wilson is that type of guy that they really needed. I really felt like Calvin Austin already kind of brought what they were looking for at that, in terms of that archetype of receiver. I thought the Steelers could have looked at Jalen McMillan out of Washington, who ended up having a really good second half of the season for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Got drafted in the same round, got drafted after Roman Wilson. And I really thought that was the guy they should have gone after. In terms of how I view the receiver room, I think it's just a reload. I really do think that like Pickens is the guy you still have to go with. You might not want to sign him to a long-term contract given all the issues that has happened like off the field in terms even on the field with how he handles certain things. But he is a talent and they don't really have anything that can replace him as of this moment. And I don't know if teams want to take on, that type of personality. So they kind of just have to add someone next to him. And I don't know, man, the prospect of just having DK Metcalf and George Pickens in the same wide receiver room just sounds like an absolute nightmare, both PR wise and as like a, for defenders. Like they're just going to have to deal with so much vertical, game breaking speed down the field, given, how they can stretch a defense. But as far as I'm concerned, I really don't think there are a ton of like free agency options. Chris Godwin is maybe like the only guy I'd be kind of looking at, but I think they need to look at the trade market, which is what they were doing last year. Didn't come to fruition, but they really need to make something happen this year because they can't just go in and run this back because this isn't a great wide receiver draft. And you might find a guy on day 3 that you might like it, to fill out your wide receiver room, like a Torrey Horton. I kind of like him out of Colorado State.
Oh yeah.
But I really just do not view the Steelers wide receiver 2 situation as a situation that it cannot stay the same. It needs to change. And as much as I like Calvin Austin, he's more of a wide receiver 3, your tertiary receiver type.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with the Calvin Austin conversation, especially. Like he can be used in specific ways, but there was a little bit too, another guy I feel like there was at times a little bit too much of. But I it's weird. Like it feels like to me if I were in Omar's situation and 21 comes around, like, and Ibuka or Burden or both are there, like, I don't know. I'd be hard stuck to pass on him. I do think, like, to Nick's point, you can't run this back. If you're looking to go for a day 3 guy, then fine. But I would be a little upset if I were a Steelers fan. Those 2 guys were available, barring maybe some other big slide from a defensive lineman or something, of course. But if those 2 guys were there and I had an opportunity to give Justin Fields another weapon, which is going to be big for him, I'd be kind of upset if they passed on him.
In terms of day 2, though, I'll give one name, Alec Ayamoner out of Stanford. Big blocking wide receiver. Ran a really good time at the combine, which I was pretty happy about. I love this dude because I was told his interviews, like they asked him like his favorite play was, and he said it was a play where he was blocking on duo run, and I was just like, this dude's like talking about his highlights and he's talking about blocking guys, and I'm just like, that's what the Steelers need. So I feel like that would be a guy that they should go after if they were looking at day 2 receivers. Day 1 is really interesting because I don't know if the value lines up, but they might have to pull the trigger. So I kind of agree with your point about Ibuka and Golden to an extent about that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, my last proposal would be something that I don't think is going to happen, but I do feel like it should be more of a possibility than some people are thinking it is. George Pickens, and to Nick, you kind of alluded to it. Like maybe they don't want to pay him. Like maybe they don't want to extend him. Like, are we entertaining the idea of him getting dealt? Because it was something that I don't think is going to happen, but Matt Harmon has been constantly bringing it up this offseason. He did it again today as I was wrapping up my notes, and I'm like, damn it, dude, like leave this alone. Like I want to drop it, but he keeps bringing it up, and that's when it comes to receivers, and you know, he's the receiver whisperer. So I have to keep my mind open to it. What does he field? Where could he go? Would you trade him? Austin, what were you thinking with that?
I don't know. I mean, until we know what's available to them, like, because if they trade him and there's a run on receivers in the draft and they're not getting Godwin and they're not getting DK Metcalf and they're just going to be stuck with like Darius Slayton and Roman Wilson for next year, I would not like that. So I'd really like to make sure that there is like a receiver available to you that can take over that kind of role. I do agree that at times someone like him can keep you from winning football. Someone that like just feels like such a distraction. And I'm not sure how much of a distraction he is to the team. You know, I'm not in the locker room, but it feels like there's a new thing every other week that somebody's really upset about. So I don't know how much of a market that would pull. You know, other teams see that, and I'm not sure that they want to bring that kind of person in, especially when 1,000-yard receivers, they don't grow on trees, but you can find them. And I don't know. I feel like I would try and keep him if I was Pittsburgh, but really focus on just honing him in and focusing in more on the leadership aspect of his play than trading. But I do see an avenue where it would be a really good idea.
Yeah, I think it's something that I feel is I don't know. The more Matt talks about it, the more I feel like it's a reality. I don't know. There's just he wouldn't be talking about it if I feel like he didn't know something. So it's just If we woke up,
you mentioned Nick Farabaugh, by the way. He talked he added his off-season thoughts or what he was hearing at the combine, and he said there was like more thoughts about like Pickens not being traded as opposed to like trying to put a guy next to him as opposed to replace him, which is very interesting considering how the season ended, and it just seemed like Buzz was just like completely headed towards a breakup. So I thought that was extremely interesting to see that perspective. I'm not sure if it's going to come to that, but again, like I really don't think there's anyone who can replace Pickens right now, and they're just kind of locked into him as far as I'm concerned at this point.
Yeah, I think like a week ago, Khan said he had a meeting with Pickens. I guess it went well. So yeah, it does seem like they're gonna try and stick together, maybe go to a couple therapy sessions and work things out. But it seems like he'll still be a Steeler. It's just if we woke up in a week and he was gone, I wouldn't be the most surprised, I guess is where I'm going. But
yeah,
we will get into the offensive line. Now, this will be a mess, I would say. Nick, the offensive line, you're the Steelers guy here. Break it down for us.
I really would qualify this as a rebuild more than a reload, just because there's a lot of uncertainty about like how I kind of viewed this whole thing, but it's probably going to turn into a reload more than anything. I think there's going to be a lot of looking at like depth for like swing guys as opposed to like going for like starters. The Steelers do not seem to be very interested in addressing offensive line very highly in the draft as this moment. So I kind of, as far as I'm concerned, I view it as a rebuild. It's more of a reload right now. Let's start with the promising. Zach Frazier looked like a dang superstar in his rookie season. He was one of the best centers in football, and I'm not even understating that. Like he was that guy. He was relied on in pass protection. He was that guy as a run blocker, consistently created opportunities, was the absolute king of the reach block for the wide zone system. Really put that unit together, allowed them to stay together. Mason McCormick had a bit of an up and down rookie season. He came in for James Daniels. Daniels is such a good player when he's healthy. Unfortunately, his season was cut very short. He is an unrestricted free agent. They're it's most likely looking like that they're just going to let him go as far as I'm concerned. Maybe they're relying on Mason McCormick. He was pretty up and down. I had high hopes for him as a guy who could be great down the line as a future asset. As of right now, he was just mostly up and down with his rookie season. It's hard to really think like they want to hand him the keys like right then and there, but maybe that's where they're going to show some faith in that regard. Isaac Samalu, he's getting older, but he's still like reliable as a veteran. He's still there. He's he's definitely that guy you can count on. Got a pity Pro Bowl vote, pity Pro Bowl invitation due to a bunch of guys dropping out. He wasn't very happy about the whole situation of being there because he didn't think he played to the standard that he deserved that. So I appreciate Samalu's honesty, but he's a good player. Troy Fautanu, I had very high hopes for him in his rookie season. Unfortunately, injury struck. He was unable to really get going this season. As a result, was not able to put a consistent amount of games under his belt. And the Steelers, this is where my rant is going to come into play. I really do not understand why they're bringing back Pat Meyer. He has made a ton of baffling decisions on where to play certain guys. When James Daniels first came to the Steelers, I was viewing him more as a center in that regard and thought he could fix a lot of the issues there. Kevin Dotson was played out of position. He played more left guard instead of right guard. And some guys they can switch sides and they could be more comfortable. But then there are some that don't have that scheme versatility. And, they don't quite feel that, comfortable, playing on the other side. Your muscle memory is different. Or as Kevin Dotson put it, it'd be like trying to shit and then the toilet paper's on the other side and try to grab it with your left hand instead of your right. So yeah. I thought that was funny just thinking about that. But like Pat Meyer has made a lot of bad decisions in that regard, and he had Troy Fautanu playing more at right tackle as opposed to left tackle, and he had Broderick Jones playing. But because Broderick Jones was the only one who was healthy, he was playing right tackle instead of left tackle because Dan Moore was honest to a fault, said only he said he could only play left tackle. So Broderick Jones was playing out of position the entire time, and whenever Fautanu was on the field, he was also out of position as far as I'm concerned. Now, I think he can play more out of position than, say, like a Broderick Jones, who is much more raw. And I have much more concerns about, given how his second season went. He has no idea what he's doing with his hands. He's consistently two-hand punching. He's lunging, consistently leaving his lower half out. And it leaves him so vulnerable to getting beat around that arc consistently. It just seemed like he really struggled. And he wasn't used enough as a run blocker, like as a pulling run blocker. Even that was starting to like not really come together. So Broderick Jones has a lot of question marks. There's like a lot of like uncertainty about a guy who was drafted in the first round. He was raw, and he still is at this moment. So going into his third season, they really need to see a lot of growth out of him, or they're probably going to have to pick another, offensive tackle in this next coming draft, given, the struggles that he's had. Dan Moore is a free agent. I doubt he's going to return. The Steelers' depth behind, their starting offensive line is very much in question. They would very much need to get a swing offensive tackle / guard in free agency or the draft. And I don't view this position as one that's like, I just don't think it is a catastrophic failure, but I do think it is like getting to the point where you're kind of scared that their investments are not going to pay off the way you would want to.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I struggled with this one because a lot of the guys feel like they're good enough to stay on a football field, but they're not bad enough to replace, if that makes sense. Yes. they're not like making your offense better, but they're not bad enough to where you can replace them. And arguably my favorite one, Fautanu, I think he's a left tackle. When I scouted him at left tackle, I thought his left tackle clip was super clean. He was one of my favorite prospects all of last year, and then they immediately drafted him and said, "All right, pal, you're actually going to right tackle. So immediately relearn your footwork, immediately relearn your cadence. Like it's going to be really hard to immediately switch." And I know he had a few good moments in the very brief time that he had playing right tackle before he got hurt, but the body of work still isn't there at right tackle, and I really wish he could stick it left. Broderick Jones, completely agree with you. His hands, he kind of plays like he's wearing boxing gloves, if that makes sense. Like he has arms, but he doesn't have any grip strength. Like he doesn't actually really know what he's doing with his hands. On top of being a good athlete, good length, like he has every like measurable, every physical aspect you'd want, but he hasn't put it together, and he's getting a little too experienced to still be a project at this point. I absolutely loved Frazier. I loved Frazier's tape. He's, to me, a top 10 center in the NFL already, which is crazy for a rookie to do. McCormick, my words I wrote were fine, could upgrade if available. So I thought he had a few good moments. I thought he was up and down, like you said, but I think that the ceiling is very limited with McCormick. Ciamalo, same thing. I wrote good, age 31. So you have a guy he's fine, he's good, but age 31 is actually like almost the exact time that you see offensive linemen start to decline. So I definitely would like to see a long-term swing kind of tackle guard hybrid, like you said. But yeah, like you said, it's not a team that I necessarily need to rebuild because no one's bad enough to have to like get out of town. But I really would like to see some depth and a short leash on Broderick Jones.
Yeah, I love the Zach Frazier love. He was on my personal second team All Pro team. Yeah. He was my second team center. He was exceptional, and he wasn't supposed to play this year, if I'm not mistaken. I think he plugged in for Herbig, right? Or Herbig got hurt early, if I remember.
Yeah, they were supposed to like kind of have a battle, like a center battle, which I think some people felt Frazier would win already. But then, Herbig got hurt before the season even really got to start, so they never even got to battle. Frazier won, and it clearly was by far a better center than Herbig has ever been. So it could have worked for Frazier.
Absolutely. On that point of who they could bring in, I thought I took the route of the draft. I decided to dive into this too and see who might fit that depth tackle spot. And Chase Lunt came to mind. Like he's the UConn 6'7" guy, 6'7" mountain man. Super athletic. He blocked in that zone run scheme, and the guy can get out of his stance quick, and he can meet someone. He can climb quick. He can pull. Anything you need to do, he can probably do it. Like he's a guy that in pass protection you probably are a little bit afraid of, but speaking to the whole Justin Fields thing, he could probably plug in to this offensive line if in dire need and not be detrimental to the operation. So I saw him and I thought it made sense. My best shot at it.
Yeah. I mean, that dude can absolutely move for a tackle prospect. Maybe a guard because I don't think his arm length actually ended up being all that good for a tackle.
Yeah, you were right.
So
yeah,
it could kind of be interesting, but yeah, I think that if they get him, the Steelers found their Dan Skipper, but like much smaller and faster.
That's a good comp. All right, we'll go to the defensive side of the ball. We'll start with I kind of lumped defensive line and edge rusher together.
We can do that for the sake of time. Yeah.
All right. So with that said, I, for whatever reason, don't understand why trading TJ Watt is not an option. I feel like at this point, at 30 years old, after seeing how much Crosby got today, they're not in a win now position. They only have 6 draft picks. They can use he's much more useful as what you can get for him in return, I should say. I think what you can get is much more useful to this organization than what he's going to provide to you in the next 2 to 3 years. So I want to get your guys' thoughts on that before we dive into the rest of the roster. Is trading TJ Watt something sensible for them to do?
I think it's hard. I think it depends on what kind of pool you get for him. I think part of it is going to be loyalty as well. I think that the Steelers have had a better relationship with him than the Browns have had with Myles Garrett. So I think that they're a little bit more keen to get rid of him. I mean, he was trying to kill people on the field, and TJ Watt's really been nothing but like a good staple to the community. So I think that does play a bit into it. I think that they want him to retire as Steeler. I think he wants to retire as Steeler. So I think it'll be hard to like look at it from a business perspective. It does make sense though when you do have guys like Alex Highsmith, when you do have the other Herbig that are really good players. But I don't know about like guys like Herbig as a full-time starter. Alex Highsmith, when TJ Watt's not playing, I don't know if he's quite the same player. I think that TJ Watt's his production's gone down, but I think part of that has to do with like the huge gravitational pull that he brings on the defense to an offense. So I guess if you're getting a couple firsts, then it might be time to look at it, considering his age and some durability questions. But that's hard to do considering like how well loved he is and how well he's probably still going to keep playing.
Yeah, I guess I didn't look at it. I'm looking at it from a strict business perspective. Yeah, I mean, Nick, you could probably speak to that. TJ Watt's probably like the most beloved human being in the city of Pittsburgh, so at least he's up there.
I think you're absolutely right from a business perspective. And if we were looking at it from strictly that sense, I definitely think you have a lot of merit to that argument, because we look at the Steelers' time window right now. They've kind of wasted Cam Hayward's time there as it stands, and he's still trying to fight off Father Time as much as he is. The thing with TJ Watt, he's a player who has been mostly reliant on his athleticism, and we kind of saw like a little bit of the cracks with his game start to show this past season, where he wasn't as winning as much with power or inside counters as much. He really wins off that outside shoulder. He likes that speed rush. He likes that rip off the edge. Like, that's his go-to, because he's a bendy guy. That's what he relies on. I think he kind of realized, though, because he kind of talked about it after the season. He said, I think I might need to expand my game more if I want to keep playing. And I think he's right about that. If he wants to keep playing in Pittsburgh, if he wants to get that next contract and stay there a Steeler for life, like the Steelers probably want him to, he's got to expand the rest of his game. He's always been a good run defender. He's great as a backside edge guy, especially coming in pursuit. His effort is second to none in terms of guys on the field, but he's definitely got to expand the aspects to his pass rush repertoire, which I honestly thought earlier in his career he was more prone to doing, and then he kind of just settled on that outside speed rush more than anything. But we look at what Nick Herbig did this past season whenever he came in. I have such a high opinion of this guy. I really think he can be a starter on any other team as a starting edge rusher. I think he is that type of player. And if anyone asks me my opinion about Alex Highsmith, I will tell you he's one of the most well-rounded edge players in the entire league. He's a great run defender. He is unlike TJ Watt, he has such a huge bag of pass rush moves. He understands how to set up that inside spin counter so well. He's been working on it ever since he was at Charlotte. I've actually know him personally, and it's a great thing, seeing him succeed in the league, but also just seeing the hard work that he had to get to where he was. We see with this edge rusher room, they have so many great pieces. So if Watt maybe does not have the bounce back season, or per se that season that shows that his age cliff can be fought off, then I definitely would see taking a franchise tag and trading him after the season. I definitely don't think you can do it this season, though. I think you have to keep TJ Watt in as long as you absolutely can. And as far as I'm concerned, they need him for 2025.
Yeah, that's a good question though, because especially Myles Garrett's been his counterpart of comparison their entire career.
Yeah,
and now that one is kind of hitting the stage of life where he gets dealt, this is also the stage of life where it feels like TJ Watt's at his most vulnerable to be dealt. So that actually was a really good question. It's got me thinking a lot more about it than I ever really did before today.
Yeah, it I just can't help but think of the aggregate Twitter accounts that that tweet out TJ Watt had no recorded stats tonight. 0 tackles, 0 assists.
Cody
0
Ford.
ATB.
Yeah.
Literally, I saw one when I was looking earlier today, and it just made me chuckle. It's like, thanks, aggregate. 0
Yeah.
stats.
I remember Cody Ford locked him up one game, and everyone was ready for him to retire. They were like, he's done. He can't do it anymore. Cody Ford had him in jail.
Oh man, yeah. Well, I think I am prone to look at things more business like.
That's
Cut
fair.
to the damn chase. Forget the feelings. Money,
I have.
seats, Ashen seats, championships. And I know it's a lot more than that, especially for an organization like Pittsburgh, who, what they've built up, and the Rooney family, Tomlin, like top to bottom, they are all about that kind of thing. So
exactly. And I think it's hard to stray away from that as much as like there are going to be scenarios where it does come up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, though, on the interior, what do you do on the interior? It's been often mocked, Pittsburgh, being interested in the interior defensive line at the 21st overall selection. But there are names out there in free agency available for trade that they can also supplement that spot with. So, Nick, what would you do at this selection? Are you looking for an interior, or are you gonna default to free agency?
So, in terms of this being a rebuild or a reload, I definitely classify it more as a rebuild because I think they're looking for their heir to Cam Hayward. I think they want to move Keanu Benton to the 3 technique and not have him play as much nose tackle. I just don't think that's been the best fit for him. He's not that guy who can really take on the interior double teams, like being handled at the point of attack like that. They might look at some nose tackle options in this class. In terms of just taking an interior defensive lineman in the first round, absolutely, man. I'm big fan of Oregon's Derek Harmon, just absolutely tested out of the gym. And in Indy, I really like his body composition. He's not a guy who's too top heavy, even though he's got longer legs. Like, again, he carries that weight super well. You see his ability to like bend off those corners. One of the big problems he had this past season was finishing consistently. It kind of reminded me a little bit of Stephon Tuitt when, he played for the Steelers, and it really sucks everything that happened with his personal life. And I really hope that he can find, everything that he needs in life. I really do feel for that for him as much as possible. But in regards to Tuitt, he had issues, finishing plays in terms of creating sacks. Like a lot of times he would get a lot of pressures and he wouldn't always get the sack numbers that you would want. Harmon was kind of similar. He had a lot of missed tackles in the backfield. There were a lot of instances where he couldn't really finish those guys, but he was consistently disruptive. And that's usually a good sign for a player that, this is a guy that is going to be productive at the next level. Disruption equals production, and while it may not always translate to the box score, that's a guy that tends to translate at the next level. So for me, Derek Harmon at 21 is looking like my favorite personally. I really like Darius Alexander out of Toledo as well. Built in a similar mold, those long arms. I was extremely pleased with what he did at the Senior Bowl. Like, that's where I actually got familiarized with him. I was watching him win off the edge. He was in a 2-point stance off the edge as a wide 9 edge rusher, and he's making Josh Connerly absolutely work for it off that outside shoulder. And I'm just like, this dude's a freak.
Yeah, he's like 305 pounds too.
Exactly.
That's actually ridiculous.
Yeah, and he tested out of the gym at the combine. So that's a guy I definitely believe that they should, be looking at as well. And then, we look at the nose tackle class. There's a lot of depth, especially on day 2 and day 3. There's that Jordan Phillips out of Maryland who had a pretty good shrine week. I was pretty pleased with how he looked. And then my personal favorite, CJ West out of Indiana, absolute monster. I love the shock that this dude has on contact with his hands. I watched him against Michigan. I clipped about 14 or so plays. I only put a few on the timeline, but he was a man amongst boys. He was stacking and peaking, just showing incredible ability to 2-gap as a nose tackle. He was consistently creating pressure in the backfield. I was really impressed with that aspect of his game. If the Steelers came away with like a CJ West and like a Derek Harmon, and I understand that the Steelers are also probably going to want to move on from Larry Ogunjobi as well. That's one thing I wanted to make sure to get across.
Yeah.
Cam Hayward's air is a huge part. Derek Harmon could be that guy. And then moving Keanu Benton, more to that comfortable role as a 3 technique with CJ West at nose tackle. That's a dream for me. Like that's what I want to see them come away with. If the Steelers aren't going to be as like entertaining like on the offensive side of the ball, at least make them entertaining on like the interior defensive line, which had some struggles this past season in the run game towards the end of the season.
Yeah, well, I mean, like you're speaking our language, bringing up Darius Alexander, because like we've been both humongous Darius Alexander fans. I am a huge Derek Harmon fan, and I think that him being the heir to Cam Hayward would be like a match made in heaven. I know some people are Walter Nolan fans, but like with I don't think his play style would really match that heir role, and 2, I don't think from what we can tell about his personality so far, that's something else that the Steelers really need to deal with. So far, everything that's kind of came out about him, a lot of teams came away negative about him. So Derek Harmon seems fully positive in terms of character, in terms of work ethic. I love that fit. I do agree, like moving Keanu Benton to more of like a 3 tech role would be a little bit better for him, especially as a run defender where like he doesn't have to take on so much power at one time.
Agreed.
I do like bringing in just an old vet, somebody that can just swallow double teams and let the other guys do their job. Guys like a Puna Ford, like someone that won't be that as expensive.
I like that.
Somebody that can just eat double teams, record maybe 2 tackles a game, but like their value is so much more important than that. If you actually watch, like guys like DJ Jones, like I feel like these kind of guys can be cheap but be really high value to Pittsburgh.
Yeah, that's kind of how. I mean, Puna Ford was with my team Buffalo for a short time, and that was the kind of thing he was doing too. So, yeah, I mean, the interior defensive line is there's a lot of avenues you could go with it, and I do quickly also want to ask, because I wanted to earlier and I didn't, but speaking to how I was mentioning, if Buka and Burden were on the board. In this case, for the defensive line, if that's what you're targeting, there's a chance that there's a handful of guys that you're comfortable with at 21, and you'd be fine with any of them. It feels to me like my conclusion for Pittsburgh comes back to potentially trading back a little bit if the opportunity presents itself, because only having 6 picks, and I feel like a lot of question marks as far as depth goes, it kind of those 2 things kind of buck heads. So I feel like if you have a handful of guys at receiver, which you might be looking at, or defensive line that you could be looking at 21, then that should be an option for them too. So I wanted to also throw that out there, because we haven't really touched on the draft specifically as much, and I think that's an opportunity for them come draft day.
Yeah.
Linebackers, Elandon Roberts, I think has to be back. That's my 2 cents.
I love him.
That's all I got.
long time fullback Elandon Roberts, as we went over a while ago. That guy is like one of the most polarizing linebackers. Like I would never purposely ever put him in man coverage like on anyone if your life depended on it. But as a run defender, he might be like my favorite linebacker in the NFL to watch. Like that dude is like as old school as it gets, and his run defense was so valuable to them. Like I don't think it can even be stated. But I don't know if he can come back. I mean, the linebacker room, especially with like Cole Holcomb coming back, it seems like it's going to be like 3 to 4 guys deep of having to pay them. So if the financials allow for it, absolutely, I'd love to bring him back.
Yeah, I hope that they do. Like like you said, he's just fun to watch. He's just a pure joy to sit on your couch and be like, I'm so glad I'm not the other asshole that has to go up against this guy right now.
Hope is an understatement for me. That is my favorite. That was my favorite part about watching the Steelers this past season, because watching him make a run fit is just so beautiful, because he takes on that contact and he runs through it, creates all that disruption. He is that type of like absolute like block penetrator that they absolutely desperately need, because I don't think Peyton Wilson is quite ready for that role just yet. No. Like, he's a promising player. There was a lot of good plays in coverage. He really shows a lot of range to be able to get those like outside zone plays where they test you with their speed. But Roberts is really that guy who is the glue. He keeps this run defense from falling apart. So I really want to see them bring him back. Was huge on the addition of Patrick Queen. He really brought the room together. And I think they're overall, like, the linebacker room, I'd have almost like zero complaints if they are just able to bring a Landon Roberts back, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I had the same thing. I'm just gonna lump the safeties in with them because the safeties, like, they have like nothing to say about them. It's the same two, and then maybe some depth. So like guys like Deshaun Elliott too, bringing him in as a run defender was one of the best things that they've ever done. Who was like their second best run defender, it felt like, on the team. Like, he was such a monster that I felt like he was worth mentioning with the linebackers because that was almost his role in certain games. Yeah, Patrick Queen kind of had an up and down season, but he definitely had some games where he really, really flashed. Kind of this like downhill trigger that I think the other guys kind of lack. I think I agree with you on Peyton Wilson. I think he's just kind of he has like a tall, lean build, and I think that his aggressiveness can kind of make up for like what he lacks in like that density. But yeah, he still has a ways to go and to ever be like what a Landon Roberts is. And I don't think Patrick Queen is really that either. So I do think it's pretty important to bring a Landon Roberts back. I don't want to make Cole Holcomb like that guy.
Yeah, especially coming off like what has been an unfortunate circumstance with his injury. You really feel for him and like everything that's going on with him, but like you can't rely on that. You need to bring back a Landon Roberts. He was the linchpin of your defense, so to speak. But you mentioned the other linchpin of their defense, Deshaun Elliott. There's a great stat from Next Gen Stats. He made 108 out of his 111 tackle opportunities in 2024, which is a 97.3 tackle efficiency rating, which is the highest in their history since 2018. And there are people who, chart, tackle attempts and stuff like that. Josh Carney over at Steelers Depot, he said it was the best tackling season he's ever charted for a player for the Steelers. And we saw what happened to that safety room when he went down. It was a mess. They could their run defense fell apart. Their pass defense, they could not communicate. Nobody was on the same page. It just felt like there was nothing like Pittsburgh was doing correctly back there. It felt like Elliott was the glue that held everything together. And when he went down, similar to what happened with Minkah Fitzpatrick over the past couple of years, it just falls apart. And they really need some depth behind those type of guys. Like I don't really know exactly how early they should address depth, but I like Jalen Reed out of Penn State. Was a pretty big fan of how he looked at the combine. I don't think safety is like one of their biggest needs, but I do think it is one that they need to get depth to address, because I don't think they can handle a Deshaun Elliott and Minkah Fitzpatrick injury. I think the entire safety the entire secondary might give up 100-yard touchdowns for the rest of the season if that happens.
Yeah. The only guy I had as a safety, like for depth wise, I had Jonas Senker from Virginia as kind of a guy that just kind of feels like a Steeler. Like he's not the Minkah Fitzpatrick role. He's kind of more that Deshaun Elliott type of player. But I think that he can, turn his hips eventually and kind of be a second option safety. But yeah, like you said, there's not really much to do in terms of this linebacker and safety room, except for just bring back the guy in the Landon Roberts and maybe add like a flavor of depth. But that's really it. I think corner is the one that has a little bit more questions and a little bit more volatility.
Yeah, that was where a lot of my notes went too. It's like, I can't figure out if Dante Jackson is going to be returning. It's like it almost the way that I think we talked about George Pickens, and it kind of feels like you have to stick with him because like what else are you going to do? It kind of applies here for me with Dante Jackson, because if you move on from Dante Jackson, then all of a sudden you are opening yourself up to such an immediate. You need to find an option immediately. Like you can't just coast into the season with some sort of Band-Aid. Like it 21st overall, all of a sudden cornerback becomes a priority, even more than it, arguably already might be. Or, in free agency, you have to spend more money on a guy. Like, if you can bring him back, I'm speaking as if it's necessarily their choice. It's not. But if you can bring Dante Jackson back, I think I absolutely would. But, Nick, do you think they are going to is the big question.
I don't necessarily know if they would, and a lot of it has to do with his up and down play. I don't think he fits their system at all. I don't think he's a man coverage type of corner. They really like their press man, long corners, like, as we've seen with Joey Porter Jr. on the outside and what he brings to the table. Their 7th round pick, a couple, back in, I believe it was 2023, was Corey Trice out of Purdue, and I really liked his tape. But he's had injuries. He's not been able to stay on the field. It is one of the key aspects. Do they show faith in him by handing him the keys and stuff like that? I don't think they can do that per se. But I think where the questions become a lot more concerning is the slot cornerback position. They were an absolute catastrophe down the stretch. They did not have a guy who could come in and make plays against the run consistently, which they ask a ton of their slot corners. They want them to create disruption on those types of runs, and I haven't had that guy since Mike Hilton walked out the door. Mike Hilton was such a huge part of that run defense in that blitz package that they have not been able to replace. And while Beanie Bishop showed some promise as a ball hawk, he surprised me in a lot of aspects this season in that regard, but I don't think they want to hand him the keys. I don't think they're comfortable enough in that regard. I think they might look at like Nate Hobbs, who's a free agent from the Raiders. Their secondaries coach, Gerald Alexander, was the safety coach for the Las Vegas Raiders this past season. That connection could bring in Nate Hobbs over, who they really need. They need a guy who can play in that slot corner, maybe even be able to slide outside. I was also looking at Asante Samuel Jr., for the Chargers. He plays inside and out, and I think that's what the Steelers need. They need a guy who could play inside and out, similar to how Willie Gay used to back in the day for the Steelers, because as far as I'm concerned with outside corner, I don't think you're going to be able to address it in this draft because I just think they have too many other needs at other spots, and they might need to show a little bit of faith in a guy like Corey Trice. So if they're going to have to do that, and let's say the injuries do prop up, you need to get somebody in free agency that can really help alleviate, those potential concerns. So Nate Hobbs, Asante Samuel Jr., those are the type of guys I'd be looking at to solve that slot corner position.
Yeah, you touched on actually everything I wrote down. So I kind of wrote down one thing was that like I felt like I was going to upset some Steelers fans. It's like I don't think Beanie Bishop is the upcoming, Kenny Moore of slots. I think that he made some really good plays. I think that he had some balls fall into his hands. I think that he did do much better than you would expect from a tidy UDFA corner. But I do not view him as a long-term solution, as a full-time starting slot corner. And like you said, having the Mike Hilton type of run defender of a slot corner is really, really important, especially with how much man coverage they run. Having a guy that can kind of diagnose that is really, really important. And then I actually wrote down Asante Samuel Jr. He was the only free agent I wrote down for them because I feel strongly about that fit. I feel like they have the financials to get that done, especially after his injuries.
Yes.
And I really would like to see this get done. I view him as a guy that still can play perimeter. He's short, he's 5'10", but I think he can do it. And I also project him to the slot. He's a good tackler, a good run defender. I'm a really, really, really big fan of Asante Samuel.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. You're barking up the right tree with this because, like I said, with Asante Samuel Jr., he plays inside and out, and because he has that experience, if an injury were to strike, at a certain part of the outside corner or even the slot position, he could just instantly move. And I think that's what they need. They need a guy who can move inside and out. And given Corey Trice's injury history and the fact that they might be rolling the dice on, taking a leap of faith with him. Yeah. As much as I like him, he needs to stay healthy, and they're going to need a guy who can kind of alleviate that potential concern.
1,000%.
Yeah, that will be something to watch for sure. Going, I think that's kind of flying under the radar in terms of what needs to be done with Pittsburgh. And it's all receiver, it's all defensive line talk, but what happens in the defensive back room, with the cornerback room specifically, is certainly a bigger storyline than I think people are giving it credit for. Going to the draft and everything. But that will pretty much touch on everything roster related. I had one last question. I'm going to say that we all sum up for the sake of time in a couple sentences. And Nick, I'm going to ask you first. What does it take for the Steelers to finally say, Mike, your time here is done, Mr. Tomlin?
I think what needs to happen is the Steelers need to have that season where everyone just gets hurt and they just have that number 1 overall pick. I just don't I don't think it's going to happen as long as this man is just going to keep winning games. And I don't blame the Steelers organization for not wanting to move on. They're historically, they don't do that. So as far as I'm concerned, get ready for another 10-7, 9-8 season.
Yeah. Same boat. I think that until you can find another coach that can offer you guaranteed amount of wins plus more, like I think I can't imagine going after a guy like Kellen Moore would make me feel any more happy about the future of my team. And like he said, he wins. So for now, I don't think you can do it until he stops winning. I can't fire him. Like I just can't. I can't encourage that.
Not just that. One thing I want to add: the whole appeal of the Steelers organization right now is not the history of their winning. It's not the history of this organization. It's Mike Tomlin. He draws the free agents' attention. Why did Patrick Queen want to come to Pittsburgh? He wanted to play with Mike Tomlin, and that's what you see a lot of these guys. That's the draw of the team. Why would you want to break that up? It's such a huge risk. So I completely get why they can't move on from Tomlin, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I read an excerpt that Davante Adams, and a question he was asked a couple months ago, and he said, I have the utmost respect for Mike. If the opportunity presented itself, I would absolutely consider it. And like to what you were saying, Davante was referencing Mike Tomlin as the reason why he would go to Pittsburgh. So that is another very fair point. Once again, I'm thinking, like, I guess for me, as if I were a Pittsburgh fan, how many more of these repetitive seasons could I take before I go stir crazy and I'm in a dark corner, like teetering? Like that's how I feel. That's how I picture the average Steelers fan, because that's how I would feel having to go through the same old cycle. And I do think there's a point right now where you could say X, Y, and Z is why he's still here. But I think at the end of this past season, for me at least, you could start saying, well, A, B, and C is why I would move on. And maybe the risk to reward is a lot more worth it than it used to be. You might be afraid to venture into the wilderness of the unknown, but at some point, if the things don't change, you might have to, for better or for worse.
Yeah. His most fireable offense is his assistant coaches. It's consistently who they bring in: an offensive coordinator, offensive line coach. They just don't stick around, and they don't tend to be long-term solutions, aside from Mike Munchak a couple of years, back in like the 2010s. Yeah. Great signing at the time.
All right. Final thought. My last thought, and my actual answer to your question: they can fire him when he doesn't win with a good quarterback. He's only had bad quarterbacks. So when he finally gets a good quarterback and doesn't win, we can fire him. That's my answer.
I don't know when that's going to be.
I don't either. They're not in position to do that again.
The year is 2032. Mike Tomlin is still the head coach of the Pittsburgh Steelers.
Well, you heard it here.
Literally. It's almost like he seeks out these, like, it's almost like what Kyle Shanahan does to a default. Like, he seeks out these limited quarterbacks so he can make himself look better when the team overexceeds. Literally, he's like, hey, look, I'm going to look better if this guy does well somehow. So, hey, let's do it. Like, I don't know. But, yeah, I don't think I have anything else. We are running well on time, but I think this conversation was very healthy, very, very insightful for anybody listening. So I hope that you did enjoy. If you made it this far, I want you to please check out all of Nick's socials and where he pods down in the description below. All of that stuff will be linked. Be sure you're checking out Against the Blitz, the socials for the pod, and ourselves individually down in the description below. But yeah, thank you, Nick, for taking the time. I hope you learned something about the Pittsburgh Steelers tonight, because I certainly did in a lot of different ways. So a big offseason to look ahead for them. But yeah, we will see you guys in episode 17. To the thing.